Good afternoon. Thank you for having us today, Mayor's Institute on City Design. I'm excited to have this discussion with you all, both Kathy and I. I think this has been, a growing and budding conversation that we've been having with, jurisdictions, our neighboring jurisdictions and folks from different parts of the country, just in terms of how we got to where we are in DC, and specifically reimagining outdoors. So we will go through this presentation as well as open up for questions and answers. I'm really excited about your questions, so let's get right to the presentation. If we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned before, I have the honor of serving as the district's first director of the Office of Nightlife and Culture under the leadership of our mayor, Muriel Bowser. And this is our going on 2 years. So if one would have asked me in your second year, you'd be sitting in the front seat of trying to figure out how you can keep restaurants and nightlife thriving or sustaining or even alive at this point, I probably would have reconsidered. No, just kidding. I'm enjoying it. It's tough work, it's challenging, but I'm along for the long ride. And I'll let Kathy give give her intro about what she's been doing outside of government.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. And I commend all of you and all of your cities, as everybody has been charged with navigating this really unique space. I will just chime in with a couple things here. I've been here running this trade association, this local trade association, for 8 years. Prior to that, I was in private sector working for Comcast for probably 8 additional years. And then I was also a part of the district government, both on the executive and legislative side. So this is somewhat rounding out many different sectors and looking through many lenses as I've been trying to help this great industry that we have locally grow and move forward. But same as Shawn, like there is no comparison to helping people understand how unique we are as a restaurant and food service industry pre-COVID versus how essential we are during this pandemic to make sure that everyone can reopen, that we can approach recovery in a productive way where we are not leaving anyone behind, and we are also ensuring that we can do it safely so that we're building public trust. So delighted to be here. Shawn has been a warrior by our side as an industry in this local market. So I'm hoping that all of you in your cities have great partners with your industry organizations as Shawn and I do, because it has helped significantly.
I can tell you, if you do not have a Kathy Hollinger in your city, you need to find one. It will make your life a whole lot easier. So let's get into it. So just a little bit about the Office of Nightlife and Culture. This was an idea that started, I believe, in Amsterdam with the first night mayor, and it made its way around Europe a little bit. I think it caught the attention of some cities in the US, more specifically New York. Our council member in Ward 4, Brandon Todd, was very instrumental in actually traveling to New York, sitting with their council, getting a good idea of what the Office of Nightlife was about in New York. And we took some of their language and built our own legislation here in DC. The mayor signed it late 2018, and here we are. Next slide. So one of the first things that we did in DC, we all know that we have a thriving hospitality industry here in DC, but we wanted to take a closer look at nightlife to get a better understanding of what some of the challenges are, but what are some of the highlights we can take from, excuse me, we can take from the nightlife industry. So we were happy to conduct this nightlife report where we took these great stats from it. $7.1 billion is spent that night. $562 million is what the city generates in sales tax revenue. It's 65,000 jobs. It's 2,400 establishments. And just to give you a comparison, New York reported about 600 or 700 million in sales tax revenue back in 2018. So although we have about 18,000 less establishments, the city is seeing pretty much around the same amount of sales tax from nightlife. So we're happy. We were happy about where we were when we announced this in February of 2020. And as you could imagine, on the heels of announcing these great numbers that you see, we went into March where we completely shut down and had to, readjust and adapt internally as well. So we've been shifting throughout the pandemic, even pre-COVID, in terms of what, the core values of the office are, what the role is. And I think the pandemic has helped us establish better relationships with our external partners, including the Restaurant Association. Next slide. So we also have a Commission on Nightlife and Culture where they meet quarterly to discuss issues that impact nightlife and culture and offer their suggestions to mayor and city council. They also engage with the public on issues that operators and employees may have as well. The commission is comprised of several different stakeholders from government and outside of government. We have a restaurant representative, someone from visual and musical arts, et cetera. So it's a good makeup of 15 commissioners. And I think I'm passing it over to Kathy on the next slide to talk about RAMW.
You are. So Restaurant Association Metropolitan Washington, we are, as I mentioned, we are the local trade association representing food service across the region. We are actually celebrating our 100th year as an organization. Haven't been able to celebrate much in terms of that 100 mark this year, but we will for sure make up for it. We are very proud of our strong roots here locally. We are about 1,300 members strong, and we are 92% plus independently operated and owned. So that is what makes us very unique as a market, is that we are not necessarily the large chain restaurants or franchises. We are homegrown, locally owned and operated restaurants. So many times while we talk about food service, we also are at the table to represent small business, whether it's delis, whether it is fast casual. That is really the makeup of our region. So we are Washington, D.C., but we are also suburban Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland. We are also a part of a partnership with the National Restaurant Association, where similarly, we're working with cities and states all across the country, depending on policy issues, and particularly during this time as we are in a pandemic. I will say that our primary focus has always been to advocate, to be a resource and be a community for our industry. Not much has changed, but our scope has changed slightly in that we really, like everybody, had to pivot and redirect as an organization to really become a rapid response first responder for our industry in private sector. Whether it was early March and what everyone had to do as they were thinking about scaling back, what they had to do in terms of dealing with their employees, or as we went into many phases of reopening, and now as we're thinking about and approaching conversations as it relates to recovery. you know, during COVID and over the last 7 months, again, what we found was instrumental is that if we are a stakeholder group of 1,300 plus small businesses across this region, and particularly and mostly in Washington, D.C., we need to be partnering with government in a way that is solutions driven. And what I appreciated, what I think that any organization would appreciate of their elected officials and their government, local government, is that none of us knew how to navigate this uncertain time. No one had the answers, and everybody very humbly came to the table to say that we're committed to getting through this together, but we're also committing to learning that we may not have the answers, but we're going to do everything in our power to glean insights from our stakeholder community and work with the government to make sure that we can look at hole patching relief currently and what we need to do moving forward. So really our role hasn't changed much in terms of our primary focus as a trade association, but given where we are, we had to hyper focus on what is most important, and that is reopening safely, and building public trust so that we can be the same thriving industry that we once were pre-COVID. Shawn, I think I'm teeing it back to you.
And speaking of reopening, you know, we're up to talking about the advisory group that the mayor put together and tasked different committees with strategically thinking about how we can reopen DC in different sectors of business. And as you can see, we had former Secretary Michael Chertoff and former Ambassador Susan Rice leading the charge to provide the mayor and DC Health with guidance from each business sector. And Kathy and I, you know, took on the responsibility of managing, you know, a group of food retailers in this restaurant and food retail subcommittee. And we can go to the next slide. So this kind of gives you an idea of what we spent hours, day and night on the phone, on Zoom, and both Kathy and I, you know, on the phone really talking about what this type of guidance meant for food retailers. And I will tell you that Kathy did not sign up for the role that I tasked her with. And I say that I want to make sure that the point gets across that I wanted to make sure that I had someone externally that was able to help me push the government's agenda forward, but also with considering what the needs and the requirements and the wants and the desires of the restaurant industry were. I was able to relay a lot of that information back to the administration. So, you know, although I served as the associate committee director of this subcommittee, I really think it was a group effort between Kathy and I to really nail Jose Andreas and others down to really get their support on the guidance that you see here on the screen that we were able to submit to the mayor and DC Health. And I think for the most part, the health department and the mayor have both taken most of this guidance and has incorporated it into what we call phase 2, is what you see stage 2 on the screen. We're currently in phase 2. I know some of our neighboring jurisdictions may be in phase 3 and maybe you know, further ahead in terms of guidance and what's permitted and not. However, I think Mayor Bowser and the health department here, we've done a good job of sort of controlling the environment here in DC and not really moving at a pace where you know, we could start to see a trend in a spike in the virus, and so without going too deep into you know, the phases, I just kind of want to get Kathy's perspective of how the subcommittee went. I know, you know, we spent a lot of time on the phone talking back and forth about the disagreements of the group, and trying to figure out how we can all come to common ground. And Kathy, can you just kind of speak to how we ended up with this guidance that you see on the screen? Because we didn't start here. And I just want everyone to know that, you know, like Kathy mentioned earlier, it's a very fluid situation, and no one coming into this advisory group knew how we would come together to have this guidance that you see.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I will tell you, as Shawn was talking, I was holding my chest because that's what the process, it was a constant, it was constant consensus building, really. And that is something that, you know, for all of you as government or elected officials, that you have to do that every single day. I don't necessarily have to do that every day, but it was something that as we, Jose Andres, for those who know Chef Jose Andres, you know, he's an international legend in terms of a philanthropist. So he is very, he is equipped to deal with crisis, and he does it in a way that is admirable, but that in itself could bring its own layer of challenges, knowing that as an industry, operators are not necessarily as sophisticated as his operation is. So while we represented the voice of establishments in Washington, D.C., we had to be really mindful as a voice being a part of this group that we were representing every size, every kind, every level of sophistication, while adhering to what the mayor felt was most important, and Shawn was an ambassador to ensure in this committee, but all subcommittees, and that is that we are looking through a lens of equity to make sure that no one is left behind as all considerations are put on the table, so that what may work for the majority of operators of restaurants who are savvy and have been in this market, it may not be feasible for another size restaurant that is either new to the space, is smaller, or is more disadvantaged. They may, whether it's Black and minority owned, that don't necessarily have the same level of access to cash, capital, all of what is needed to just pause. That is what I found incredibly insightful, not only in gleaning information from the industry, but as the conversations with Shawn and the city evolved. And that is probably the time that Shawn is speaking to, that was spent to make sure that perspective is really heard, knowing it was so important to reopen properly, because restaurants didn't want to reopen and then have to be shut down again. So everything was a gradual, modest steps forward with a lot to consider. As many of you may know, restaurants interact with more regulatory agencies than any other industry that I can think of, particularly in this country. So to ensure that recommendations made sense, and knowing that there was a willing ear from Shawn and the city and the mayor to think through what that could mean in terms of real regulatory streamlining. That was really important. So I will say that it was amazing lessons learned, and really spoke to true collaboration. But I think Shawn would probably agree, what was most enlightening was listening and thinking about considerations that took everybody into consideration versus what we may feel is a typical profiled food service establishment. So, you know, kudos to the mayor, really, for Mayor Bowser, for collecting this team of thought leaders to be able to put a blueprint forward. And yes, for the most part, most of the recommendations that came out of private sector industry in terms of what works and what doesn't, it was absolutely captured in where we are currently with phase 2. I think the unexpected was just the timing, how long we would stay in a particular phase or stage. But I would assume that every city and every state around the country is dealing with something similar.
So Kathy, we got a comment in the chat that says they are ready and eager to get their question answered. So we're gonna move right along.
Great.
And glide through these next couple of slides. You can go to the next slide. This is just one of the efforts of the Small Business Micro Recovery Grant that we, back in, I think, April, we were probably, March, I'm sorry, we were one of the first jurisdictions to offer some type of relief to small businesses. Restaurants and clubs and bars were able to take advantage of this as well. Next slide. As you can see, a little over 1,000 restaurants took advantage of it, as well as some nightclubs. And these are just a breakdown of the dollar amount that was awarded to restaurants and nightclubs. Next slide.
Yeah, I think this is me, Shawn, and
Yep.
I'm not going to add much here. I want to glide through this, but it really is just showing that throughout the whole process, it was the idea that we were establishing programs and grants that may not have been funded, but at least are positioned. If money is freed, they can go into additional established grants that exist to keep the relief going. And the legislative support. So working with the executive and Shawn, it was also working on the legislative side with the city council and finding any kind of hole patching relief and low hanging fruit to offer relief for restaurants to be able to pause and be able to rethink what they need to do to keep money in their business. Everything from 15% cap on third-party delivery fees to allowing there to be a little bit of flexibility around tenant payment plans, and then to the subject at hand, right? Extending outdoor dining and streetery allowances through the end of December 2021, which is a huge win and allows a little bit of time for money to be recouped if we get to that period where we're actually in recovery.
And just to note on that last point, there's been consistent effort on the executive side as well as our friends on council to ensure that outdoor dining is allowed and continue to be allowed for the foreseeable future. Again, just some more ways that our ABC agency here in DC has been able to offer relief to businesses. We also have been working with the Office of Tax and Revenue to ensure that businesses are able to negotiate and work out some type of payment arrangement for those who haven't been able to make sales tax payments due to the pandemic. Next slide. All right, I think we sort of jump into our Streeteries and Parklets program that has been really well managed by our Department of Transportation here in the district. So restaurants with existing sidewalk cafe space and or new and expanded outdoor space can apply for what we call a parklet. And that's literally space in the parking lane directly in front of the establishment. And they can use that space for outdoor dining. The picture that you see is what we call a streetery. And this is where we have multiple businesses expand in the street. We shut down the street for vehicular traffic, and it's used primarily for outdoor dining. The space that you see to the left where the cone is a fire lane, and that's been consistent with our streetery rules that you need to have a fire lane in order to expand dining to the street. Also, our community organizations, our bids, our main streets, our ANC, I call them community community elected officials are able to apply for a streetery permit on behalf of businesses as well. And we can go to the next slide. So a runoff of the streetery permits, it literally was, I'm sorry, I need to plug my computer up. It is dying. Sorry about that. It literally, this grant program was a runoff of the Streetery and Parklet Permit Program. We started to hear about businesses thinking and concerned about the winter months. And I will tell you that the importance of this relationship that I have with Kathy, this is one of those moments where it was essential. This literally came from a conversation that Kathy and I had on one of my morning walks, where we were talking about how government could provide relief to businesses. And this is what we came up with. And so this was pitched to government, and we decided to use some of our remaining CARES Act funding to fund this program of $4 million. I will note that because we weren't recognized as a state, we were short at $755 million. So the fact that we were able to offer $4 million for this program really shows the importance of restaurants and small business that the administration has really taken into consideration. So if you have an outdoor space, if you already have a sidewalk cafe, or if you expand outdoors temporarily due to the public health emergency, or if you have a rooftop or outdoor space on private property, you are eligible for the grant. We wanted to keep it local, so there are some local stipulations and requirements as well for resident employees, ownership, 50% must reside in DC, etc. But we wanted to keep the requirements broad and the spending eligibility broad as well. So businesses have the opportunity to literally spend it on whatever makes sense to them to winterize their outdoor spaces. So we've seen from patio heaters to furniture, to pillows, to lighting, etc. So we started to roll out funds yesterday. We issued our first grant disbursement yesterday, and we should have, excuse me, we look to have all of the $4 million out within the next 2 weeks. Next slide. So also in addition to the permit process, then you have the grant process. We put together a guide with several other agencies to offer not only guidance, but additional relief. We have worked with our Office of Risk Management to make sure that we push back the new insurance requirements a year from December. So the new requirements won't go into effect until January 22. Our fire marshal's office, we've got them to bend a little bit without jeopardizing safety on the propane requirements. We've waived the propane permit fees. We've waived the tent fees with our consumer regulatory agency. And the health department has given us some guidance that, not what everyone wants, but some guidance that we all can live with in terms of how to operate these outdoor spaces, more importantly, the tents and air circulation, etc. Next slide. And I'll kind of let Kathy talk about the aesthetics and what we've actually seen in terms of the streeteries and parklets, the creativeness that operators have decided to really just jump into something that really is new to everyone, and talk about some of the things that we've seen.
Yeah, so let me make one quick comment about what Shawn was talking about. As important as it was and as helpful as it was to think about streamlining and extending allowances for outdoor space, thinking about conversion of outdoor space, what we also were hearing loud and clear from the operators is that this is great in terms of the permitting, the streamlining, making it easier, but it costs money and it's a lot. And how, in fact, are we going to be able to create this trajectory where whatever money we're investing in this to keep going, that the ROI is somewhat transparent. And that is why this, the grant was so important. And as Shawn was talking to the mayor and talking to folks on his team, it was the idea of how are we addressing relief in a very real, immediate time and need. So I say that to say that, you know, $6,000 does go a long way. And the reality is that we always need more and more and more and more in terms of relief. And cities are really strapped with the funding sources that they have. But it was also looking outside of the government, and takes me to this slide, in partnering with some of our private sector partners like the development community. And this is an example from JBG Smith, who is a big partner of our organization, our industry, that was also parallel to all the relief that was happening from the city, from the streamlining and permitting and allowances and extensions that the city was providing. They were also providing helpful resources to restaurants on how to best winterize their outdoor space. Because again, we're all learning. We don't know how to do this. We're all trying to figure this out. So we found and heard that creating a really welcoming space where diners were feeling trusted was what was most important. And of course, picking the right heaters, right? So it's not as simple as everybody assumed it would be. The right heaters, safe heaters, flaps down versus flaps up. There was a lot to consider. And finding the partners within the government, as well as the partners outside of the government who have that intel and are specialty, they have their specialty in that particular allied service as a business, is what we found incredibly helpful. And Shawn can probably speak to a little bit of the tenting specifications that worked in the city versus what doesn't work. These are some examples of how creative restaurants are being, whether it's creating an open air greenhouse effect, whether it's the canopy style tenting where it's open air, but it allows for heating, it offers outdoor space. And then in the upper left-hand corner, that is a little bit more of a indoor with some outdoor elements, but I would think that that is considered much more indoor than what we would typically encourage in DC. But it does show how creative these restaurateurs are across the region in trying to welcome guests back in where they are comfortable to dine.
Thanks, Kathy. This is just another example of the DuPont Streetery. We can go to the next slide. I know there's some questions. So our downtown bid has taken the opportunity to shut down one of their streets and offer outdoor dining. And they've had this large, advertising campaign to really attract some folks downtown who has probably seen the most severe impact of the federal government not being in the city, and them trying to figure out ways to keep businesses alive downtown. Next slide. I think we're at the end. Good. Okay.